So have you ever had one of those ideas that deep down you just know it's not going to work, but you really have to see it through to the end anyways? Well, let me tell you why it took so long to make this video. Now, to be clear, the half-scale pinball machine isn't going anywhere, and in fact, I've actually made a lot of really great progress on it over the last few months. But what I really want to talk about today are the trials I went through trying to come up with a display for the machine. This all started a few months back when I was thinking up some cool ideas for animations of the machine. And along with that, I needed to come up with what kind of display I was actually going to put these animations on. Well, the fact that I wanted to do animations at all pretty much ruled out score reels or segmented displays, although you can do a little bit of animation with those. But pretty quickly, I settled on a dot matrix display. And the reason for that is, one, I think it's period appropriate, given System Shock came out in 1994. And the other reason is, I'm not that great with art. I can manage basic pixel art, but anything high resolution like you'd see on a newer machine, I'm not going to be able to do. So I figured a traditional 128 by 32 dot matrix display, specifically a green one with 4 levels of grayscale, because I think it looks good, I felt that was going to be the best choice for me. So the problem now is you can't buy a dot matrix display that's 128 by 32 and half the scale of the one a normal pinball machine would use. Believe me, I looked everywhere. The smallest size I could find had a 2mm pitch, but at 2mm pitch, a 128 wide display is still 256mm wide, which is almost the entire width of my back box. So I started going down the route of how can I build a display with a smaller pitch? And what I kind of landed at least initially, were these things called, I think, nanopoint SMD LEDs. They're supposedly the smallest SMD LED you can get. The problem is, while they may be small, it would cost several $100s to order the over 4,000 of them you need for a display of that resolution. And personally, I don't have the skills or the patience to solder that many. So I would have to go with a service like PCBWay's automated assembly to do it, but that's still several $100s. And when you totaled it up, it was going to be over $700 to make this thing, and that's even assuming that I would be able to route the traces to get the LEDs that close to begin with. So clearly, that wasn't going to work. This is where I kind of started to lose the plot just a little bit, and I started thinking, if there are physical constraints to how tightly I can pack the LEDs together, what if I could just take a full-size panel, hide it somewhere inside the machine, and then use fiber optics to route the light to a smaller panel on the outside? The idea, at least in my head, seemed reasonable. Well, I decided to start testing this, and thankfully I was smart enough to do a few small tests using an 8x8 matrix before going out and building the whole display. But that's where I started running into problems right away. The first idea I had was to take some 1.5mm filament and just make a square outer frame that I could pack 64 fibers into. And my hope was that the frame, being rigid, would force the fibers into an 8x8 grid. Unfortunately, things didn't play out that way. Two things I didn't realize was that, one, the fiber I ordered had come in a coil, and it did not want to uncoil very well. So I ended up having to make the frame a little bit bigger to accommodate the fact that the filament just wouldn't fit in that space. And I think that's because the arc of the fibers were taking up more space. The second issue, which may be related to making the frame bigger, was the end filaments just didn't align themselves into a grid. They were all over the place, and I couldn't even push some of them all the way down because the fibers were so densely packed together. And, you know, there's probably some ways around that. I probably could have pushed the fibers through and then just shaved the excess off the end, but if this was already a problem with an 8x8 display, I knew it wasn't going to work if I scaled it up. So I moved on to my second idea. So the next idea was move down to 1mm filament and create a grid of holes of 1mm size with a 1mm pitch. That way there'd be an individual hole for each filament to be pressed into, and that would help force the grid shape. In theory, again, this seemed like a good idea, except the problem I ran into was my printer just could not reproduce that. In fact, not even the slicer could. I have an FDM printer with a 0.4mm nozzle, and the slicer just would not render those thin 0.5mm walls between each hole. Now, I was able to tweak the slicer settings a bit and eventually get it to produce G-code that would actually print them, but the problem then was the printer couldn't do it. And yes, I could use a smaller nozzle, but then you run into, is it even going to print? Is the nozzle going to jam up? It's a whole mess. I really don't want to do that. So this is where I made a really poor decision, and that was, what if I use a 1.9mm pitch? Now, obviously that's going to make the final display bigger, so then what if I reduce the resolution to 100 by 25? So I still get the 4:1 ratio and a roughly similar size display. In hindsight, that was a really stupid idea because, like I said earlier, you can buy a fully made matrix with 2mm pitch. So this whole ordeal just to come out with a 1.9mm pitch display really would have got me nothing. I tried it anyway, and actually it worked, and I think it worked pretty well. I was able to produce the display, but there were still problems. The main issue was it took 4 days to make it. Why? Because the holes ended up being too small, so I had to drill them out. Once I drilled them out, they were too big, so I had to glue each individual filament in instead of press fitting them. Now you might say, why didn't you just make the holes bigger? Well, I tried. The problem was, again, the resolution of the printer. It just couldn't consistently produce the same size hole. The holes on the outside of the model were bigger than the ones on the inside. And I'm sure I could have done a bunch of tweaking to fix that, but the reality was it was just too much hassle already. The second issue was, even though I was able to glue the fibers in, some of them pulled back slightly before they dried and I didn't notice it. So some of the filaments are actually further back in the display panel. And that might not seem like a big issue, but the problem is with these fiber optic filaments, when they do that, they appear darker. Now, I don't know if that's because of a viewing angle issue, because it's recessed in the hole, or if some glue got in front of it, diffused the light. I don't know, but either way, they are noticeably darker. So yeah, again, just like the other idea, there's probably a way to make this work, but scaling it up to 128 by 32 when I'm already having issues at an 8x8, yeah, it's not gonna happen. And to be honest, even before I finished this design, I knew it wasn't gonna work. It's just I had to see it through to the end. Now, despite none of these ideas really working in the end, I don't feel like the time was wasted. I just enjoy tinkering with things, and I thought it would be fun. That said, it doesn't solve the problem that I still need a display for my machine. What I've ultimately decided to do is what a lot of other people do, and just use an OLED panel for my display. But I'm not going to use its full resolution. Instead, I'm going to use software like Mission Pinball Framework to have it emulate dots on the display. Now, I actually knew I could do this from the get-go. I just didn't want to because it kind of felt like cheating, and I didn't want to take the easy way out. But at this point, I've tested enough things that I feel comfortable going with this option now. The only trick at this point is just finding a display that'll physically fit in my back box, which means I need a very narrow monitor that I can fit just behind the media panel, but it also has to fit between the two speakers beside it. Now, I've actually found a couple promising options for this. I found one company that sells a 256 by 64 pixel display. The only problem with it is it's actually a little bit small. It uses 0.53 millimeter pixels, which are just a little bit lower than the half scale I'd like. The other option though, and I just found recently, is apparently the automotive industry uses 1920 by 480 panels. I'm not really sure what for. I assume maybe part of the infotainment system in some cars, but either way, they're a 4:1 aspect ratio. And I could probably crop out the rest of it behind the media panel of my machine. In fact, I've already checked and there's just barely enough room to do it and still keep two 2-inch speakers on either side. Either way though, I'm kind of done with testing displays for now. I know at this point that I have a path forward and I'm comfortable that it's going to work at least reasonably well. So I want to move on to other parts of the machine. That wasn't all the work I got done though. As I alluded to earlier, the whole reason this started is because I was thinking about different animations for the machine. So I want to talk a little bit about what I've thought up so far. First and foremost, if you start a new game of System Shock, there's a short intro video that kind of explains how the main character got captured, how they ended up on the space station, and how they inadvertently set loose a rogue AI. So I want to take some of the frames of that, something like the Trioptimum logo, the company the hacker got caught hacking into, and some of the backstory, and animate that on the DMD, likely during the attract mode. So go through the usual thing of like credits, free play, press start, all that, but then periodically show this little intro animation explaining the backstory. I think that would be cool. The other thing I was looking into was some of the fonts from the original System Shock. I know that's not technically animation, but they need to be animated in the game. And what I ended up learning is that System Shock uses a lot of different fonts in it, but kind of the main one I associate with it is a font called Stop D, or just Stop. I'm not sure what the difference between them is, but it's this retro futuristic font that you see written on the walls throughout the space station in the game. So I went through painstakingly and created a bitmap font from those. Now, why would I do that when Stop D is already a font? Well, the reason is I found out that System Shock uses a slightly customized version, or maybe it's just an older version of the font, but either way, if you download and install that font now, it does not look the same as what System Shock has. A few of the letters are different. So I went through the effort of copying those over. The last thing I was thinking of, and the thing I think would be really cool, is if you've ever played System Shock, you'll periodically come across these displays in-game showing static. And most of the time, that's all they do. They just show static. But every once in a while, Shodan, the AI's face, will kind of appear on the screen briefly and then disappear. And a lot of the times it happens just out of the corner of your eye. And I always thought that was so creepy, especially because the way they rendered her face, she has this really disturbing wide smile. And I thought it would be really cool if periodically while you're playing, randomly Shodan's face will just kind of appear behind your high score on the display and then disappear. But do it quickly, just fast enough that if you're paying attention to the table, you don't notice it per se, but you realize something moved. And by the time you look up, maybe you just catch a glimpse of her face fading out. I thought that would be a really neat effect. So I started looking at recreating that. And so far it's going pretty well. And those are kind of the animations I've come up with so far. I'll keep coming up with more, but just wanted to give you an idea of what I'm thinking of. Oh, and by the way, if you do want to try making your own fiber optic display, I've gone ahead and linked my CAD and the few other videos from other YouTubers I found down in the description. My blog's also there as well if you want to look into more of the technical details of this whole endeavor. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.